Just as an anecdote, this was the text that I preached when I was candidating for this job, which is kind of fun. I don't know if you remember, but we were at Eastgate United Church of Christ, because in the UCC we do what's called a neutral pulpit. You have to preach somewhere that's not your church and not their church. And I was preaching on this text, and so I just thought it was fun that this came back around this year. After all the things that we've been through and all the changes that we've made, because to me, this text is really about this idea of integrity. That this whole story, this whole series of time that they've been in the wilderness, Exodus and Numbers, is really about this idea of covenant and God's commitment to the people. What's the phrase, right? Integrity is how you behave when no one's looking, is the one I learned. I want to say it differently. Integrity is how you behave when you're losing. I think that's even more important, because how you behave when no one's looking suggests that your integrity is like this thing about how you look in the world, but I think that when you're losing is really when your integrity is tested. Because are you going to pivot and change and start doing dirty tricks because you want to win, because you feel like it's unfair, because you feel like you deserve blah, 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 whatever, whatever, whatever. Our integrity is how we behave. It's who we are when we are losing. Now, this story from Numbers 21 is the final story of murmuring. It's the final murmuring story. And there's been a lot of these throughout Exodus and Numbers, of the people crying out and complaining, oh God, this is terrible. What I love here is that they're literally going to die of hyperbole. There's no food and water, and we hate this miserable food. And this water isn't very good either. Right? Like, they're literally in the wilderness. They're almost at the end of this time, right? They're coming up to the edge of Moab, and this is kind of really the point at which, really right here in Numbers, is where they transition out of the wilderness and then eventually end up in the Promised Land. And so they've been doing this for a minute, right? Like 30 plus years, right? They've been in the wilderness. And every step of the way, they have been taken care of. At first, they'd cry out and say, we're hungry, and God was like, oh yeah, duh, you should take care of that. But then later, they're like, we're hungry, where are you? And I feel like God is sitting up there like, seriously? 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 But God keeps being God, and God keeps providing for them. Now, the title of my sermon when I preached this almost 10 years ago was, God Doesn't Take Away the Snakes. And I still think that this is one of the most important pieces of this passage, is the people go, they're going to die of hyperbole, they're going to die complaining of something that they have, and they go to Moses and they say, Moses, we messed up, that was dumb, again, we've been here before, you know when you've done that mistake like 100 times, and you have to still go apologize for it again, and you're like, I know I've rehearsed this, I've given this to you a few times, I'm going to try to tweak it, I'm going to change a couple words so it isn't the exact same apology I gave you last time, I did the exact same thing. Right? But could you ask God please to take the snakes away? This is like really not fun. And Moses is like, cool. And God's solution is for Moses to make a statue. That's the solution that God comes up with. But I really like this solution, because what it means to me symbolically is God is not going to take away all of the hard things. God is not going to take away the consequences. God is not going to take away the screw-ups. God isn't just going to wipe it all away. Because we got here, right? Like, y'all know that climate change is happening, right? Like, there's no undoing this. We are at the point of cascading effects. We're all agreed on that, right? Like, we're not in this world that seems to still exist, where like we can stop, like we can prevent cascading ecological disasters that are coming in the next 30 to 50 years. Like, we're all on the same page, and it's a losing battle, right? The question is, how then shall we live? And this is the same point that's made by the snakes not going away. God doesn't say, I'll take away the snakes, I'll undo the consequences of your behavior. God says, I'll help you live with it. You will look at this statue and you will live. There's still going to be snakes. The harm still exists. But you're going to be able to live if you keep your eyes on the right thing. I feel like that's the message for the climate crisis, is we're not going to undo this. This isn't going to go back to whatever fantasy beforehand we had, because we'd have to go back quite a ways in order to undo all the industrialization. But we're going to figure out together, if we choose to, how to be together as a global human family to figure this out. Like, we just showed a film recently about immigration into the United States. And most of that film was really about American military and economic interests that produced a lot of mass migration out of Central and Latin America. But that's not going to be the story into the future. The story into the future is going to be climate migration. Climate migration is going to be the greatest mover of people around the world, and it's only going to continue to increase from here. And so the real question is, how are we going to live with the snakes? What are we going to look at? What are we going to orient towards? What are we going to lift up that's going to help us figure out how to live with the snakes? Integrity is how we act when we are listening. Now, here's the thing about the story about Moses, because, right, Moses goes back to God again for the 900th time to get forgiveness for the people. And at various times, Moses has been ready to give up on them, right? At various times, God has been ready to give up on them. Moses had to remind God of who God is and what the covenant is in order to get God not to just be like, I'm going to start over with you, right? We got that story a couple weeks ago. Now, here's the trip. Just a little bit before this in Numbers, the people come and they complain to Moses about a lack of water. Now, that's a real concern when you're in a desert, right? You can't, think about how heavy water is. You can't just like carry enough water to get you very far in the desert unless you have like all this equipment and vehicles and stuff to get it for, I mean, we're talking 600,000 people. Like, that's a lot of water you're going to need. You're in the desert, and they're complaining about not having enough water. And Moses gets pissed, and he goes to God and he says, what am I supposed to do? And God's like, tell you what, just take the stick and just go hold the stick out, and they'll see water come. And Moses goes and he gets the stick and he holds the stick out, and he's like, you people just whine and complain all the time, and all you want is water, water, water. And then the stone breaks open and the water rushes out. And they're all like, awesome, this is great. And Moses is like, oh. And then God's like, dude, that's not what I told you to do. That sure made it look like you made the water happen. We both know who made the water happen. But here's this terrible part of the story, is the conclusion here is God is like, dude, you don't get to go to the promised land. You decided that you were the one who was in charge. And you let your anger and your bitterness about this people, which I totally understand, by the way, because we're there. But you let it take over, and you didn't let me be the star of this show. You don't get to go to the promised land. And it's kind of said almost in this like cast off kind of way. Moses doesn't respond to it. God's speech about, you don't get to go is like a sentence, and then it moves on from there. But I just think about, and here's Moses. Now the people are being bit by these snakes. And he's, in his heart of hearts, he's still kind of like, yeah, you deserved that one, didn't you? And I'm not going to go to the promised land, and you guys are coming to me, and you're mad about being ridiculous, and you want me to pray to God, and he doesn't hesitate. He still goes and prays to God for the people, even though he has had all of this just breadth of disappointment from them, and has every reason to say, forget you guys. He's still a person of integrity, even when he's losing. He knows he's not going to make it. In fact, Aaron's not even going to make it. That dude's about to die on the mountain in a minute. But there's this sense that, like, okay, The promised land isn't the thing that we have to wait for to be people of integrity. We don't wait till everything's fixed. We don't wait till everything's okay. In fact, ultimately, there is no promised land. And this is the thing we've been learning in this Bible study we've been doing every week, is that at the end of the day, they get to the promised land, and what do? They make another Egypt. What do? They make another empire that continues to exploit the people. There is no purity. There is no perfection. What we need is a system and a process to admit that we screwed up. We need something that we can lift up and look at and orient towards to turn us around. Now, we are doing a terrible job of that in America right now. We do not seem to give our enemies, let alone ourselves, permission to be wrong and to just eat crow and move on. Right? If you make a mistake 10 years ago, we're going to hold that against you now, and you can't really apologize enough for it. You can't really pivot enough for it. We just need pure and perfect people, or people that have been doing everything in shadows for long enough, hiding who they really are for long enough, and paying off people who knew them back when, so that they can be our leaders, because we expect this perfectibility paradigm. And what we really need is a paradigm of repentance, of an honest turning to something. But what are we going to have to turn to? What is the thing we're going to be looking for to denote whether someone is a person of integrity or not? See, I think it's important that we have, and this might be controversial given your comment about Catholicism earlier, I think it's important that the dead body of Jesus is in the church, that we don't just have empty crosses. Because there's something about orienting towards the reality of suffering that's produced, that's necessary, that reminds us what we're gathered here for. If we only have glorified, liberated, gilded, beautiful crosses, we forget that it's a weapon. It's a tool of empire to silence dissent. It's a means of control. That's what it is. That's what it's for. There's supposed to be a dying body on it. Not just a dead body, but an agonizing, painful, bleeding, horribly disfigured, uncomfortable body that they want to look at and remind us to stay in our place. And so when John puts the words in Jesus' mouth, I will be lifted up, I think there's this reminder of what's going to orient us, what's going to reorient us is the suffering that exists in the world. Are we going to continue to care about that suffering? When Russia, who is actively engaged in a hostile war against another country, that it invented the conflict, and this is not a new conflict, this has now been going on for more than a decade with the invasion of Crimea. When they get attacked by the Islamic State and they get 133 people killed in a concert, that should still break our hearts. That should still be wrong. When a Republican senator gets shot at a baseball game by a fanatic, we should still be upset about that. Because it's still a person. But we get caught up in these ideas that there's a side and there's another side and I'm on this side and those people, right? What are we going to lift up that's going to bring us all together, orient us together? Because Jesus says, I will be lifted up and will draw all people to myself. Integrity is how we act when we are losing. There's one final story, it's kind of a fable or an allegory I want to tell. So there's this guy who's sitting around a campfire with a couple of friends, and he sees a snake somehow slither up a log and end up in the fire. And so he reaches his hand in the fire to grab the snake, and the snake turns around and bites him on the hand. And he yells and he drops the snake, and the snake falls back into the fire. And the first thing he does is he goes and gets a stick and uses it to scoop the snake out of the fire back into the bushes, and then he bandages his hand. And his friends sitting around the fire say, "What the hell are you doing? That snake bit you. Why did you save its life?" And he says, "It is the nature of the snake to bite. It is my nature to help." What is our nature? And what is the nature that we are being called to by orienting to the cross? By orienting not just to the triumphal entry of Jesus and waving palms and being excited and having a party, but orienting to the cross, to this murder that's about to happen, this lifting up of this man in the most agonizing and excruciating way possible, the creativity of humanity purposed for pain. And what is it going to lead us to? Are we going to respond to the world, or are we just going to blame for why things aren't working the way they're working? Are we going to figure out a way to move forward together, or are we going to look for whose fault it is that the world is the way that it is? Even if it's criminally negligent, the way that the world is. Because we can spend a lot of time focused on what's wrong and bad and horrible and make ourselves feel better. Or we're going to start organizing together to move in a direction. Are we going to lift up Jesus Christ to remember who we are in the face of evil that is designed to manipulate us? That's what this week is about. And that's what the resurrection promises, that we'll have something to orient to